Welcome everyone. I am joined today by Catherine Warburton and Mikaella Bodeux from Warburton Attorneys, and we will be having a conversation on the draft National Greenhouse Gas Carbon Budget and Mitigation Plan regulations. In July 2024, the President assented to the Climate Change Act, commonly referred to as the CCA. The CCA is a novel piece of legislation which creates a new legislative regime surrounding greenhouse gas emissions in South Africa. The draft National Greenhouse Gas Carbon Budget and Mitigation Plan regulations have been published under the CCA and have been open to public comment. Catherine, what is the legislative background to these regulations and what are the main legal processes which they seek to address?
Thanks, Carolyn. These are the first draft regulations that have been gazetted under the Climate Change Act, and they are one of two main mechanisms provided for in the Act which focus on the mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. The other mechanism is through the sectoral emissions targets, and draft regulations have not yet been gazetted on this mechanism. Section 27 of the CCA provides for these carbon budgets and greenhouse gas mitigation plans. Section 26 requires the Minister to publish a list of greenhouse gases which are likely to cause or exacerbate climate change, and to publish a list of activities which emit or have the potential to emit one or more of the listed greenhouse gases, and to determine an emissions threshold for the application of these regulations. These operations, which fall within the list of activities which emit the listed greenhouse gases above the threshold, are referred to as data providers and are required to comply with the regulations. The threshold has been set at 30,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent emissions per annum for Scope 1 emissions only, and apply at an operational company level. The list of greenhouse gases is set out in Annexure 1 to the regulations. Note that 4 new categories of greenhouse gases have been included, those shaded from G to J. And this is important as these newly listed greenhouse gases were not previously listed under the National Greenhouse Gas Emissions Regulations, reporting regulations. So there are now new industries potentially that will have to report and comply with these draft regulations.
Which industries will these regulations impact?
Annexure 2 to the regulations sets out the list of activities covered. Note the extensive scope of the industries covered. The same industries that have been reporting their emissions in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions reporting regulations are included, but additional activities are now included under the draft regulations. Those are shaded on the list, and they include activities like petroleum refining, chemical, hydrogen, sugar, ceramics and brick production, domestic aviation, food and beverage production, and mining. It's also possible to voluntarily report on Scope 2 and 3 emissions, or to voluntarily report if one falls outside the listed activities or below the threshold.
Mikaella, this next question is for you. How will carbon budgets be allocated, and what process must be followed once the carbon budget is allocated?
So the first step is for data providers to register on the department's online platform. As part of this process, data providers will be required to provide information on their facilities and their greenhouse gas emissions in accordance with Annexure 4 to the regulations. Then, at least 1 year prior to the first commitment period, and at least 2 years prior to every successive commitment period, data providers must submit their activity data to the department in the format specified in Annexure 5 to these regulations. As part of this, data providers must also submit their draft mitigation plans. This data will then be used by the department to calculate baselines for determining carbon budget allocations in accordance with Regulation 9, no later than 6 months prior to the commencement of the first commitment period. The department will then deliver a carbon budget allocation in the form of a report which will look substantially like Annexure 9. If the data provider does not submit written representations or otherwise appeal the carbon budget allocation within 20 days of receiving same, then it will be deemed to have been accepted. 30 days after receipt of the carbon budget allocations, data providers must submit a formal carbon budget or carbon budget declaration, as well as a mitigation plan. The department then has a period of 90 days within which to approve or reject the mitigation plan. The approved carbon budget and mitigation plan are then valid for the full commitment period.
Thank you, Mikaella. That sounds like that will place quite an onus on both data providers and department. Mikaella, how do the draft regulations propose to deal with new entrants to market?
Thanks, Carolyn. It is conceivable that situations will arise where an entity is looking to commence an activity which would qualify them as a data provider after carbon budgets have already been allocated for a specific commitment period. These entities are what we call new entrants. So the draft regulations provide accommodation for these situations in the form of a new entrants reserve. And in terms of the draft regulations, the department must determine an economy-wide emissions cap per commitment period. An allowance of 5% of this cap will then be made available as a new entrants reserve. If an existing data provider cancels or otherwise does not use their carbon budget allocation, then that allocation is also added to the new entrants reserve. It is possible that a situation may arise where the new entrants reserve becomes depleted. In this case, no further carbon budget allocations will be considered by the DFFE.
Thank you, Mikaella. I like how unused budgets get recycled back into the reserve. What would be considered to be a non-compliance with the regulations, and what are the penalties for non-compliance with the regulations?
Thanks, Carolyn. So there are a number of offences provided for under the draft regulations, and these can be found listed at Regulation 19. These offences include failing to register as a data provider, failing to submit a carbon budget, failing to submit a mitigation plan, annual progress report or final progress report, failing to implement a mitigation plan, and supplying false or misleading information. It's important to note here that this section does not include non-compliance with a carbon budget as an offence. Then, the proposed penalty provision under the draft regulations is consistent with what we have seen under other pieces of environmental legislation, such as NEMA, in that it allows for a fine not exceeding 5 million rand or a period of imprisonment not exceeding 5 years for a first-time conviction of an offence, as well as a fine not exceeding 10 million rand or a period of imprisonment not exceeding 10 years for a second or subsequent conviction of an offence.
Thank you, Mikaella. So the penalties highlight how seriously non-compliance is dealt with under the draft regulations. Catherine, one last question for you. What is the interplay between these regulations and the Carbon Tax Act specifically?
As Mikaella mentioned, exceeding a carbon budget is not included as an offence. However, if a data provider does exceed its carbon budget, it will be subject to a higher carbon tax rate, which will lead to higher carbon taxes being paid. However, the higher rate is likely to be applied only to that portion of the emissions which exceeds the carbon budget. What we're expecting there is an additional carbon tax rate of about 640 Rand per tonne, which can be contrasted with the current rate, which is set for 2026 of 308 Rand per tonne. So it would be quite a significant increase. Warburton Attorneys was involved in the preparation of the first draft regulations, and so we're available to assist you to understand how the regulations would apply to your specific operations and with the steps that you need to take to prepare for the advent of the regulations, such as, for example, preparation of draft mitigation plans in the interim. We're also available to assist with the preparation of comments on the draft regulations, should you wish to submit comments.
Thank you, Catherine and Mikaella, for this useful introductory information, and thank you, viewers, for watching.